This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, the State of the Union episode. I am Hal Hammons, and I am a citizen of heaven, and I am your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. I bring you this message of hope today from Pensacola, Florida. This is report number 45, dated February 11th in the year of our Lord 2020. I bid God's grace and peace to all my fellow sojourners here in this earthly plane. I remain sound in body, alert in mind, and energized in spirit. In this week's podcast, I will share my perspective on where Americans are as a nation in 2020. I've been preaching about unity and division. Jesus provides a way for all humans to come together in peace and harmony, but we have to do it His way, not ours. I've been reading What Americans Really Want, Really, by Frank Luntz. Honesty is the best policy, especially being honest with ourselves about our real values. I've been hearing the impeachment process is really over and Donald Trump is still our president. We don't always like the reality that exists, but we would do well to accept it. I've been playing Coup. Amass influence, assert power, lie through your teeth whenever advisable, and you can overthrow the government. It's a lot more fun to play than to live through. Are you ready? Here we go. This is what I've been preaching. I'm taking the opportunity of last week's State of the Union address by our president to give one of my own, as it were. Not just about the nation, the political nation of which we are part here in the United States, but more particularly the State of the Union with regard to the Lord's Church. And there's actually a great deal of overlap between the two. I don't want to make too much of a deal about this. The Lord's Church and the United States of America clearly are very different entities, but there is a lot of similarity. When you look at America, you look at the founders, you look at our history, you see that there was a grand project that our founders had in mind. They wanted to create something that was new, something that had not existed before, that brought people together from different backgrounds and different origin stories and create a unity that would be something like no one had ever seen before, that would be this tremendous existence here on earth. And they did so, and it worked by and large. There were a lot of growing pains in the early stages, of course, but people were drawn to this message, people from all over the place, and before too long, the United States was the greatest nation on earth. The Lord's Church has a similar origin story. The Lord's Church also pulls together people on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, people from all over the world that shared a common dream of the kingdom of heaven. And they found it in what the apostles were preaching in. They came to Jesus Christ and they were baptized in water in His name. And suddenly there was this new body that had not existed before, that was this remarkable new thing that accomplished great things and drew people from all over because the power of the gospel was so powerful. That being said, there are always growing pains with whether we're talking about an individual person or a culture or the church. Before too long in our nation, people were being pulled into this nation who were not like the founders. Pretty much all of our founders, with very few exceptions, the people who mattered anyway, the people who made a difference, the people whose voice was heard, were white male landowners, God-fearing men of English extraction. Virtually all of them were. And so therefore it was easy to find commonality. It was easy to come together like that. But it didn't take very long before people were coming in from other cultures, other traditions. And that made the nation better. There's no question that it made it better, but it also presented problems in the short term and in the long term. And the larger the nation got, the more appeal it had, the more people came in from other places, the more and more difficult it was to find that origin story, to find that union that had existed in times past. And before too long, the nation became fractured. And that's the State of the Union that we're dealing with right now. We are dealing with a fractured country. Whether you like the economic news, whether you don't like or don't trust the economic news, whether you have a job or don't have a job, I think regardless of where you are, you have to acknowledge that in this time and space, we as Americans aren't getting along very well. And this is why, I believe, because we have lost that commonality that existed in earlier times that supposedly we're pushing toward, but in reality, it has become a heterogeneous mess where everybody wants what they want out of the nation. Everybody wants their agenda accomplished, their priority. They want to cut in line. They want to be served instead of somebody else being served. It's no longer what is best for the country. It's what's best for me. The words of John F. Kennedy come up oftentimes. That's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We don't live that way anymore. That's not our nation anymore. Things have changed since 1961, and not for the better. The same thing is true for the Lord's church. When the Gentiles came into the company of believers, it was a difficult process. Suddenly there were people from different backgrounds, different experiences. They did not look at the world the same way. They didn't look at Jesus the same way. And it was problematical from the very beginning. It was a good thing. It should have happened. It was God's will that it happened. But there was a great deal of difficulty finding that union. And in many quarters, it was virtually impossible to find. And as the church continued to expand and continued to grow, and now people are coming to Jesus Christ from all kinds of quarters, all kinds of backgrounds, the fractiousness is even more pronounced. It becomes much more complicated to find that unity that Jesus presented in the simple and undefiled gospel of Jesus Christ in the very beginning. And the solution to our nation's problems, the solution to our factiousness in the nation is the same as the solution in the case of the Lord's church, and that is to go back to the beginning, to go back to what brought us together in the first place, to acknowledge the great plan that was set in place and to pursue that plan at our own expense, at the expense of our own comfort and perceived needs, to realize that we are in fact part of something greater than ourselves. It's about the project. It is about the large picture, not about myself. Now, depending on where you stand in the political spectrum, you may have given up, or maybe you never bought into in the first place, the idea of the founders. You may think the founders were wrong, that this whole project was a failure, that we need to try something else. You can make a case for that. I personally don't buy into that case, but maybe you do. And that's your business. This is not a place for us to have that kind of argument. What I will say is this. The founders, as intelligent, as wise, as understanding as they may have been, were not inspired by God. Their project was not God's project. That was their project. If you don't want to buy into that, that's you asserting your own wisdom over their wisdom. You can make that case. It is a very different issue when you're talking about the Lord's church. When we're talking about going back to Jesus' plan, going back to the gospel, we're talking about accepting his will as is revealed in the New Testament, as was practiced by the apostles in the first century. You may not want to do that. There are a lot of people in the world who call themselves Christians who don't want to do that, who in fact deny not only the practical nature, but the desirable nature of doing such a thing. They don't want to be the Lord's church as it's presented in the first century. And as a result of that, they have their vision and I have my vision and you have your vision, and we will never, ever come together. The only way we're going to have unity is to go back to the very beginning, to accept Jesus' wisdom, to accept the gospel in its purity and its entirety. That's what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verse number 1 and following. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. This unity is real. It can exist. It did exist. And it can exist for us as well. But as the text says, we're going to have to show humility. We're going to have to show gentleness, patience, tolerance. We're not necessarily very good at those things. But if we can do that, if we can prioritize other people before ourselves, if we can prioritize Jesus above everything, we are promised. It's not just a possibility, it's a reality. We will have the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. That's what I want. And more importantly, that's what Jesus wants. This is how we go about pursuing it. This is the only way we will ever achieve it. Anyway, that's what I've been preaching. This is what I've been reading. A few thoughts from the book, What Americans Really Want, Really, by Dr. Frank Luntz. He suggests here, we want smaller, less intrusive government, yet we want more oversight of the economy and oppose specific budget cuts. We want taxes lowered, but we won't accept a decline in the quality and quantity of services, and we aren't eager to pay for stuff ourselves. We say we want to eat healthy, but just look at what we actually consume. We say that we care about the environment, but we won't give up our pickup trucks and SUVs. That is basically a summation of the argument that he makes in the book, that we are not very good at saying what is actually on our minds. The book was written back in 2009, a very different world back then, a decade or so ago. We're still reeling from the Great Recession. Barack Obama was seen in many quarters as someone who's going to be pulling us out of that. Instead, things got worse for a while. Now things are much better, economically speaking. We talked about the political differences that separate us, which may or may not be getting better earlier. We won't get much into that. But I don't want to get into the specifics of the world that he was living in the world in which those polls were taken. Those data may or may not be relevant in the modern day. What I do want to emphasize is the overall thrust of the book, that we as Americans have what we say we want, and we have what we actually want. And those two things are not necessarily the same. And I'm not sure that this phenomenon is necessarily American either. We have this tendency to think that we are a certain way, but in reality, we're a different way. Our behavior bears out that we have different priorities than we are claiming to have. He coins a great phrase in this book, a term called McTension. I love the idea. Especially a working woman picks up her children at daycare. She's driving home. Everybody's hungry. Everybody's fussing. Everybody wants to eat. Well, what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to take the children home, and I'm going to get them out of the car, and I'm going to go into the kitchen. I'm going to spend half an hour preparing this nutritious meal of tofu and sweet potato fries and fresh fruit, and that'll be what we eat. No, I don't want to do that. The kids don't want to eat that. They're not going to eat that. They'll be fussy. They'll be cranky. Maybe I should go to McDonald's instead. I go to McDonald's. They order whatever they want. They quit fussing. Everybody's fed. Everybody's happy. Everybody's full. And everybody's quiet. It's over. What I want, what I do, not necessarily the same thing. That is built into our culture. There's a great disconnect between what we say we want and what we actually pursue. And such is certainly the case with regard to the people of God. And such has always been the case. Who are we at our core? Well, we serve God. We love God. We pursue the things of God. Oh, really? Well, let's look at our daily lives. Let's look at our habits. Let's look at what we prioritize in our lives. Is that really who we are? Are we going to adjust our values whenever it becomes inconvenient? Are we going to do the work that God has given us to do, or are we going to make excuses for ourselves? Are we going to change our terminology from time to time when the terminology that we've been used to using doesn't really suit anymore? Marriage is a great example of this. The teachings of Jesus Christ on the subject of marriage and divorce and remarriage are really quite straightforward. You can read Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12. It really lines it out there for us in pretty simple terms. And we are pro-Jesus. We want to do things Jesus' way. But reality sets in, and we find ourselves in a marriage situation that is inconvenient or objectionable in whatever kind of way, and we decide to change the rules somehow. Yes, I value Jesus' judgment in this matter, but I'm going to do this other thing instead. And so many other examples can be given with regard to this sort of attitude. We, as the people of God, need to make up our minds what we really want. And these kind of confrontational situations are just strewn throughout the Bible. Wonderful passages, like in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. Choose you this day whom you will serve. He says, you can serve the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river. You can serve the God of heaven. As for me and my house, Joshua says, we will serve the Lord. He's made up that decision in his mind, in his life, and in his family's life. That's the way they're going to go. It may or may not be the way the people go. And they answer, yes, we will serve the Lord. We will. And Joshua says, no, you won't. You're not going to be able to do this. Yes, we will. Well, then God will be watching you. God will hold you accountable for this commitment that you made. And of course, as they continue in the land of Canaan that Joshua's brought them into, they are not going to serve the Lord very effectively, at least not very consistently. And God's going to punish them for that. What you are in reality, what you say you are, those are not necessarily the same thing. The great showdown at Mount Carmel between Elijah and Ahab. Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal. He challenges the people at large. If Jehovah is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. And the people didn't know what to do. They were used to trying to do both of these things. They say they are serving God, but they want to serve Baal too. They're not able to make a decision between the two. Jesus gives us the same kind of confrontation, the same kind of opportunity for success or failure. No man can serve two masters, he says in Luke chapter 16, verse 13, especially in the context of serving money. You cannot serve God and money, he says. Well, I'm going to serve God. Oh, really? Well, look at your life. Are you serving God with your life, or are you serving money with your life? You may be surprised at what your life actually shows, in stark relief oftentimes to what you say you are valuing. This is why Jesus essentially chases away disciples. In Luke chapter 9, verse number 62, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Do not think that you can enter into this thinking in your mind that Jesus is your priority, when in reality, he's not. When in reality, you're serving yourself. That is the reason why America is so torn up in many areas, because we say we love our country, and yet we are actually loving ourselves. We're not doing what's best for the country. We're doing what's best for ourselves. How important that is, that's up to you. But that will kill the Lord's church if we take that kind of attitude into the Lord's church. We have to commit ourselves to serving Jesus and him alone at all times, not just in word, but also and particularly in deed. That is our aspiration. That is our goal. That is our objective. We will not be satisfied with anything less than that. Anyway, that's what I've been reading. This is what I've been hearing. Well, like most of you, I woke up the morning of Wednesday, February 5th, 2020, and Donald J. Trump was president of the United States. As I expected that he would be, as you expected that he would be. This impeachment process wound up exactly where everybody realized it was going to wind up, in failure to remove him from office. Whether he needed to be removed, whether he deserved to be removed, that's not our purview here. The point is that today, after the impeachment process, there are still people who protest, he's not my president, and say so in so many words. This is not a unique kind of thing. We heard people saying this in the Obama administration. We heard people saying this in George W. Bush administration. You could probably go back to earlier times also. But it does seem like this attitude has grown. There are more people who are on the extremes of society who will out and out say, I do not honor that person as my president. Now, the honor that you are supposed to give to civil government, that's a different issue. We're not going to cover that today. What we want to talk about today is reality and the accepting of reality. The fact of the matter is, if you are an American, if you are living on American shores, Donald Trump is your president. That's just the way it is. It's in all the newspapers, it's on all the websites. He's called president by the press, by the citizens, etc. This is the reality that you're living in. And I would suggest to you that you're better off accepting reality and dealing with it rather than denying reality. I realize these days denying reality is all the rage. It's our postmodernism run amok in our society. It's not just politics, it's history, it's grammar, it's math. Pretty much anything is up for debate these days. And certainly who is proper president of the United States is one of these subjects. This is a phenomenon that is seen in the religious world as well. Jesus Christ is king. There are some people who don't like that. There's some people who will deny that. He's not my king. And so therefore, since Jesus is not your king, apparently that means you can do whatever you want to do. Violating God's commands is not that big of a deal because Jesus isn't your king. I'm not a Christian. I never claim to be a Christian. So therefore, I can do whatever I want to do. That's not true. That is denying spiritual reality, and the time is going to come, I caution you, when the fallacy in your rationale is going to be revealed. There's a story that Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 27. I'm not going to take the time to read it here. I would encourage you to read it, though. It's similar to the parable of the talents, which we may be more familiar with from Matthew chapter 25. It's sometimes called the parable of the minas or the parable of the pounds. It's about a man who has dominion in a certain area, and he's about to receive a kingdom. And in Roman days, what that means is he is in charge of a country, and now he is going to be given much more power. Instead of Rome micromanaging everything that he's doing, he's basically going to be given a blank check. You do whatever you feel is right. You operate as a king. He's going to get much, much more power. And there are two groups of people that are under consideration in this parable. One group is like we were talking about before. They are the naysayers, the deniers. They didn't like the king before he was a king. They didn't like him when his power was limited. Now he's going to come back and his power is not going to be limited, at least for practical purposes, not limited. It's going to be much, much worse. And so they're all about rebellion. He's not my king. He's not going to be my king. And when the king, because he is the king, comes back to his land, he commands that these naysayers, these detractors, are going to be executed. They are rebellious. They're going to be treated like rebels. He's a king. He's going to start acting like a king. He has the power to do it. Now he's going to do it. And again, the proper exercise of government is not the point of the parable. It's not the point of this podcast here. But that's what happens to the ones who reject the rightful rule, the one who is governing their lives, even when they don't realize it or they don't accept it. There's another group of people in the parable also. There are people that the Lord was placed them in charge of his things. He gave them certain opportunities, certain responsibilities, and departed. And when he came back, he wanted them to have placed certain things in order, have disposed of their opportunities, of their resources in a way that honored him. And two of them did that, and one of them didn't. He was afraid. He didn't want to do anything wrong. He didn't want to mess things up. And so he hid his talent in the ground, just like the one talent man in the parable of the talents buried his talent in the sand. Same basic kind of thing. And this man is condemned. This man is found lacking. He's not responsible. He is not acceptable in the eyes of his king, just like the ones who never tried to serve him. This man who essentially didn't try either, he's going to be condemned as well. And this is a great lesson for us as we look at King Jesus, as we look at the prospect of serving or not serving under this king. Philippians chapter 2 and verse number 9 through 11, it lays out very specifically here that every knee shall bow. Everyone is subject to this king, whether you want to be or not. You can live your life in rebellion. You can live your life in rejection of reality if you wish. But ultimately, Jesus is your king. And if you don't honor him as king, there are going to be consequences for that. You can, if you want, lay claim to kingdom privileges. You can say, I expect to go to heaven when I die. I have this great relationship with Jesus through prayer. I'm going to offer up worship. I'm going to do these things that believers do. I'm going to do these things that servants of Jesus do, that kingdom citizens do. You can go through the motions doing that if you want to, but realize that only the true citizens of heaven have kingdom privileges. The only way to be a kingdom citizen is to submit to the king. You may not like the king. You may not necessarily agree with the king in all kinds of areas. Hey, you know what? To be honest with you, I'm not sure I agree with the king in all areas. But I do submit to the king, or try to, in every area. Because ultimately he is in charge. And it is my privilege to serve under him, including and particularly when service to him is not what I would have done ordinarily. That's what a submissive servant is going to do. That's not for everybody. A lot of people are not willing to receive this commandment. Consequences will come for those who don't, though. Anyway, that's what I've been hearing. If you want to stop listening at this point and go your way, I hope you've found the message instructive, inspiring, and most of all, faithful to God's Word. Please don't forget to like, rate, share, subscribe, and follow. But if you stick around for a few more minutes, I would like to share with you a way to amuse yourself in a wholesome manner while waiting here in Satan's world, and perhaps pick up a spiritual point or two in the process. This is what I've been playing. The word coup has been thrown around a great deal in recent months, describing the efforts to remove President Trump from office. Whether it's an appropriate term or not is a political consideration, and we don't do politics here. Surely you've got the message by now. But it gives me an opportunity to talk about what might be the most played game in the Hammons house over the last few years. That game is called Coup. If you remember The Resistance, or if you know of the game The Resistance, we covered it in the podcast several months ago. It's in the same universe as The Resistance. The Resistance is about a pocket of rebels who are trying to overthrow the government. In Coup, you find out what that government is all about, and you realize why it is that the resistance is so motivated to overthrow the government. These are a bunch of jerks. They are self-serving. They are selfish. They have no concern for anybody else. They have no morals at all. And it makes for pretty good gameplay if you're inclined to that sort of thing. There are basically 5 characters in the game, and you have cards that give you the identity of one of those characters, 2 of those characters usually. There is a duke, there is a contessa, there's an assassin, there is a captain, and there's an ambassador. And you have cards that give you those characteristics, and they're hidden from everybody else. So I may say I'm a captain, and therefore I get to take 2 of your credits from your treasury. And you say, well, no, I'm the ambassador, and the ambassador doesn't have to submit to the captain, so you can't take my money. And, well, what do? We have a standoff here. Well, I can challenge him, or he can challenge me. And, you're not really the ambassador. And then he reveals his ambassador card. If it is an ambassador card, that means I lose one of my identities, one of my lives, as it were. If he was wrong, if he was claiming something that wasn't true, then he loses one of his identities. And when you lose both of your identities, then you're out of the game. And the idea is that you accumulate enough credits where you can turn in 7 of them to stage a coup. And a coup means one of the cards at the table is removed. One of the identities that my neighbor is holding is gone. That may be his last card, in which case he's out of the game entirely, which is ordinarily a bad thing. But if the game takes 5 minutes to play, being eliminated in the game is really not that big of a deal. You're having a lot of fun, and before too long you're playing another game on top of this. It's a very engaging kind of thing. And if you don't get too caught up in the morality of it, that is, because the morality of it is terrible. The idea of I want power because I want power, and I'm going to run over anybody who stands in my way. It's a despicable attitude, and hopefully we all realize that. This is not morality training here by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it reminds me a good bit of the problem creators that James talks about in James chapter 3. In verse number 16 and following, he says, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing." Well, why in the world wouldn't it be that way? If your idea is to get as much power as you possibly can, despite the cost, no morals at all, and I have the same kind of attitude, and our neighbor over here, he has the same attitude too, how could that not be chaos? How could that not be a disaster? And what happens when that's in the Lord's church, when we are selfish and ambitious in the Lord's church? This should be about serving him. This should be about honoring him as king, not making ourselves king. The contrast is described as the text goes on there. Verse 17, "For the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Go back to the original segment here in this week's podcast. We were talking about how we can achieve this unity, how we can come together as the people of God. And this is how we do it, by pushing to the side, and if situation calls for it, completely excluding these Diotrephes types from the Lord's church and emphasizing a sense of selflessness, a sense of service toward one another, and of course ultimately toward Jesus Christ himself. The Bible has a long and storied history of people who tried to assume power that was not theirs to assume. And generally speaking, they got what was coming to them. In the short term, they serve as examples to us, negative examples. Don't be like Korah in the wilderness, for instance, in Numbers chapter 16, who decided there needed to be more democracy. Aaron and Moses had too much power. I want to be priest. Well, God swallowed him whole, as well as all those who were following after him. That kind of rebellion, that kind of self-centered behavior has always been a toxin among the people of God, and God's attitude toward it has been very consistent. Ours needs to be consistent also. If we are to have, as he says here, the fruit of righteousness that's sown in peace by those who make peace, that should be us. That should be us promoting righteousness and finding that peace of God that passes all understanding that the text talks about in Philippians chapter 4. It can be ours. It will be ours, in fact, if we will sublimate our own personal desires, not be grasping for power at all times, but rather looking for opportunities to honor Jesus, to lift him up in our eyes and the eyes of others. As long as we fight for our own personal agendas, we're never going to have peace. We're never going to have unity. The only way we can honor him in the truest sense is to avoid staging any kind of personal coup against the King of Kings and submit to the King of Kings instead. I promise you the outcome of that choice is going to be far better than the alternative. Anyway, that's what I've been playing.
Thank you for listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. If you profited from your time here, I have a few requests of you. Please pray for me and for this work. We need more citizens of heaven, and our prayer is that we be part of achieving this objective. Please subscribe to this podcast and give a good rating on iTunes and other sites that allow you to do such things, and spread the word to your friends. Please follow my work through my website, www.halhammons.com. There you'll find links to articles, videos, and books of mine. Seek me out on social media. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and especially Facebook. Look for me and for my pages, The Final Word, The Preacher, 20 Pages a Week, and Citizen of Heaven. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammons, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.